Hello and welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast from myself, Thomas Flight, and fellow video essayist Tom Vanderlinden from the channel Like Stories of Old. This week we're going to be discussing Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves. This is directed by John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein. Before we jump into that, I want to mention that this is a Nebula original podcast, which means if you listen on Nebula, you get access to the episodes a week early and without any sponsorships or advertisements. You also get access to our bonus episodes when you listen on Nebula. If you're interested in doing that, you can go to nebula.tv/cinema of meaning and sign up there, or click the link in the description below. We're doing this episode while it's in theaters, so this might be a little bit more of a review episode. We haven't had the chance to see it multiple times. At least I only saw it once. I'm assuming you also only went to see it once.
Yeah, I saw it yesterday evening, the first time.
Yeah.
And the only time, yeah.
So I guess maybe we can give some first impressions. I'm just curious, like, right, how did you feel about this? Have you watched past Dungeons and Dragons stuff?
No, I have near zero familiarity with Dungeons and Dragons as a concept. I've known people who played the RPG experience or the board game, I guess.
Right.
I haven't played it myself. I haven't watched any content or videos or movies or whatever they made in that universe related to it. So I just kind of went in completely blind. I didn't even see, I think I saw half of the first trailer and I thought like, oh, Chris Pine, comedic fantasy world, whatever,
Yeah.
Another like franchise milking movie machine. It reminded me a little bit of that Warcraft movie that came out a few years ago, which I wasn't all too invested in and didn't really care for that much. So yeah, I wasn't expecting too much of this, aside from maybe a afternoon with a B movie, I guess. But
Yeah.
I was, just to say it right off the bat, I was pleasantly surprised what this offered and what it ended up being. It's not perfect. I have a few issues here and there, but it did give me some interesting insights into certain genre elements, especially related to adventure and maybe especially also adventure in relation to comedy that might be worth getting into. And there's some interesting stuff in the way they use character archetypes, which I think is also very much an element of the game, or at least in, I've played many video game RPGs, which in many ways apparently took their inspiration from what Dungeons and Dragons established, where you kind of assume this character, you kind of roleplay as this character that has specific skills, and that's obviously something that you also see very much in this movie, where each character has their own little thing that they're good at and that they can contribute to the group, which always creates a nice dynamic, even though it does lead to some tropes that I'm personally not a big fan of, like where you have for example, now here's the mission and now we're going to gather all the eccentric members of the group that help us accomplish this. Like, there's a lot of movies that pull that off so poorly that I've just gotten so tired of it that, Wonder Woman, I think, tried it, but yeah.
This is a movie, though, where you kind of absolutely have to have it because it's sort of like an essential element of how Dungeons and Dragons, or to put my cards on the table, I have not played Dungeons and Dragons, the tabletop RPG game, but I have played other similar group tabletop RPGs. So I have experience with kind of what it feels like generally to like participate in an RPG. And I'm familiar with some of not the rules set and all the mechanics, but I'm familiar somewhat with the Dungeons and Dragons stuff. And there's a very specific feeling. Like, I really love playing an RPG because it's such a weird experience. You're like in this story that's developing and unfolding together as a group that you're kind of all improvising and all trying to think on your feet to come up with. And that can be very fun. And usually it's balanced. It balances this element of like often, I mean, it depends on who you're playing with and how seriously people are taking things. But generally, you're trying to kind of get as invested as you can and engage in this kind of heartfelt story or action, but then there's elements of it that just make it inherently a little bit like goofy and silly. And so the way those things come together is kind of fun.
One more thing that I was really happy about with this movie is that it does feel like it's kind of a weird point maybe, but it does feel like we're getting some superhero fatigue finally, not just in the cultural mindset, but also we're now seeing it reflected in the box office, where it feels like more people are moving away from yet another superhero story and towards more new and original things, even though, technically this would still be a franchise adaptation. But I did like that about this movie, that it's finally something, at least for me, something fresh and a genre that of which it feels like it hasn't really existed since the 90s or so, or maybe the early 2000s, where you have this interesting combination between fantasy and comedy. I was reminded of some movies like A Knight's Tale, Your Highness to a lesser extent. That one is slightly more farcical. But in the 90s, you also had this movie called Dragonheart. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that one.
No.
I used to love that one as a child, but it's probably not that good anymore if I were to watch it now. But anyways, the point is that it feels like a kind of genre that's kind of lost a little bit, or kind of forgotten about, and that seems to have been revived with quite successfully in with this Dungeons and Dragons story, where it just feels like you have a fully fleshed out world, or at least as much as is necessary for this kind of story. It's actually kind of more of like a heist story technically, which is also why those archetypes work so well, because the heist movie generally has, the Ocean's 11 thing where they have to assemble the team,
yeah.
and each one contributes their own little skill set. But anyways, you have this interesting fantasy world, a nice story that balances comedy, action, and drama. And that just feels like, I feel like if this came out in like 1995, it would be the kind of movie that would play on TV like every month or so, and every time it would be just an interesting or just a fun night sitting on the couch, making some popcorn, and then watching a movie like this. It's lighthearted or lightweight almost. It's easily digestible, but still fun enough that it offers a meaningful experience that's very enjoyable, I guess.
I do not regret going to the theater and watching this. I think I had a fun time.
Mm-hmm.
It captured a lot of fun elements about Dungeons and Dragons, or like I was saying earlier, about role-playing games that I think I find really fun. It actually managed to capture that. I was kind of, I don't know, I was getting pretty engaged in the beginning, but then it wore on me as it went on. I think because it really felt to me like I see what you're saying about it feels new as a genre, in that it's approaching something different from the MCU. It's a different flavor of like lore and IP, but in form, I guess. And this is where like I have so much fatigue, not for the superhero movies, not necessarily for the superheroes themselves. I'd happily watch a movie with superheroes in it, but it's more so like the format of the MCU, the kind of like way in which those movies are shot, the studio form. So I think this movie was interesting for me in that it presented like something that felt like it was really well made in almost the MCU style that is not an MCU film. I think what that allowed me to see was, oh, there's a lot of elements of just this like genre of, I don't know what you would call it, like IP, franchise, studio, action, comedy, that, I don't know, I find it kind of...
It's still, you can take the superhero out of Marvel, but can't take the Marvel
Right.
out of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't know. There was a lot here that I think was fun, and there's plenty I think that we can talk about. But let me clarify it this way: if I had just watched this based on the trailer, I think I would have gotten pretty much exactly what I expected, and I would have been like, "Hey, this is like a perfect 3-star popcorn, IP movie." But I think like I just happened to see like it had a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes or something before I was going into that. And
Hmm.
to me, this movie being like a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes feels absurd to me.
But 90%, that only means that 90% of the people had a above average, or
Right, right.
so that means if everyone gave it like a 6 out of 10, then
Yes.
it would be 100% certified as fresh. But I never liked the Rotten Tomatoes for that. But yeah,
Yeah, that's the problem with Rotten Tomatoes, I guess. Maybe this is the perfect 90% Rotten Tomatoes
yeah,
movie. It's like
it's perfectly passable. In
everybody is going
yeah,
to be like if I had to choose thumbs up or thumbs down, I'll choose a thumbs up. And
hmm
it's like most people it might be like, it's barely or it's just slightly slipping through that.
yeah,
Cuz even I would do that. I'd say like if I had to choose between total thumbs down and total thumbs up, I'd choose a thumbs up. There's enough
hmm
here to keep it going, but I was
yeah,
just like there's so much you can do with CG and with like this with like a format like this. And so it's like when they got to that shot where it's like all of them are crowded together and the camera's like doing the like Avengers style like swoop around them
hmm
I'm just like, oh, come on, just come up with something new. Anyway, I'll get this out of my system and then we can
yeah,
just
yeah.
talk about it.
I see what you're saying, and I agree to a point. You can definitely feel the Marvel vibes in this movie, and to some extent, I that's also what I'm getting tired of, especially at the end when they did that Hulk smash, where the villain is
Right,
defeated,
yeah.
but then they have to knock them
Knock them down again.
around like a few times just to make sure they're down or something like that. That to
Right.
me was like, it's just so exhausting. And the thing with comedy movies in general, and especially these Marvel type comedy films that have like a lot of quips, a lot of lightheartedness, is that they're very easy to hook you within the
Yeah.
first 10 minutes or so, but then it's very difficult, at least for me, to stay engaged over a long time. Like at the
Right.
beginning of this movie, I felt quite invested. Like I thought it was a fun opening
Yeah.
sequence, but then I was thinking of the latest Thor movie, Love and Thunder, where I also had that, where I was like 10 minutes into that movie and I thought to myself, oh, I'm kind of into it. But then a half hour passed and then I was like, oh, okay, I'm no longer into this. And I was worried that was going to happen here. And there were moments where my attention definitely waned and where I felt myself losing interest in what was going on. But there were other elements, specifically in its essence, this is very much a Marvel ish movie in the way that it's constructed, the way that it handles characters and their interactions, and the way that it does humor, and the way that it uses CGI. But there's a few points where for me it diverted enough for to kind of soften that and to kind of sweeten the whole situation to
Yeah.
make it less
Yeah.
make me less cynical about the whole thing. One of that is they clearly shot a lot on locations. There's a lot of CGI also, a lot of it quite bad, but at least there was some, especially early on, where there were the sweeping Lord of the Rings type vistas of them
Yes.
traveling against these huge, beautiful backgrounds, which kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
retroactively made me want to go see Lord of the Rings again, just because it reminded me just how good that adventure was constructed.
Yeah.
And that made me think of one thing that The Lord of the Rings did really well, which this movie did a little bit less, is where in The Lord of the Rings, they established so well that sense of distance in between spaces. Like whenever characters travel somewhere, you feel the weight of that. It takes some time, and
Yeah.
then you can see them travel for days, and then the landscape changes, but changes slowly. And the only reason I thought of that is because in Dungeons and Dragons they go from this ever winter-ish landscape to a never winter-ish landscape in like a few minutes, and they travel back into a forest again, and then they're in a swamp, and then they seem to kind of jump or skip around the map a
Yeah.
little bit too much, where you don't really feel like you're really on an adventure in the sense that you have this home ground that you begin in, and then you leave it, and then you slowly venture into increasingly unknown or unfamiliar lands. Like that kind of adventure is not really here in Dungeons and Dragons, I think.
Right.
But then again, it's also clear that this doesn't want to be that. Like I could go on for like the rest of this podcast just to complain about how Dungeons and Dragons feels at being the Lord of the Rings, and
Right.
the way we're not getting the Lord of the Rings type sincerity anymore ever
Yes,
since
yes.
Marvel, but I just don't want to do that because it's also
Yeah.
it's so obvious that this is not a movie that tries to be that. Like, again, for me, this is more. It feels more like that kind of class beneath Lord of the Rings that you'll catch the occasional rerun of whenever it happens to be on television, instead of the Lord of the Rings class, which is the one that you
Right.
actively sit down for once a year and make an event
Yeah.
out of rewatching it.
I think you said it great at the beginning where you said like this is a great, you kind of expected a B movie, and this is like a really great B movie. I think it's just
Mm-hmm.
like it's interesting that those used to be like low budget, like indie films, the B movies that kind of then like rose to notoriety. But now this is like elevated to cultural touchstone, which is fine if that's what a lot of people want to watch. It's great. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I don't want to spend the whole podcast complaining about this because there's interesting, good things to talk about too as well. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about the characters and the different archetypes and
Yeah. Yeah, that was one other thing I was going to say, aside from the shooting on location stuff, that for me diverted it enough away
right,
from the typical Marvel-ish, especially like a movie like Quantum Mania that's just all visual blur and just
right,
completely without any form of texture or sense of realness. The other thing that I liked is that the main character, at least, the Chris Pine, Atkin, is not a man of physical violence. I like that he's the bard or the planner, and that
yeah,
therefore also the final big confrontation is not so much about. Actually, it is about violence, but because they end up having to fight a wizard, but it feels less like, oh, we have this hyper masculine hero at the front of it that's gonna punch his way through the story, and that to me led to some interesting plot elements, like with the portal
right,
gun or the other, like the trickeries and magics and the stuff that the druid could do, like changing into animals, and how that.
yeah,
The point is, there was more cleverness with regards to the way plot elements progressed and conflicts were resolved that weren't just, okay, we now have two superheroes either punching each other really hard or beaming really hard at each other with some kind of magical force or spell. And that's
right,
what I generally liked about the movie until like maybe the very, very end.
yeah.
But even that was relatively restrained compared to the sometimes prolonged battle scenes that we get in a superhero third
Right.
act. Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually, I think, in some extent, the brilliance of the movie, or its best part, is as an adaptation of Dungeons and Dragons, exactly what you're talking about comes from sort of the mechanics of the game, where, if you're playing an RPG game, you have all these different skill sets, and often you can't just brute force your way through something with violence. You have to come up with a weird solution to something or take a bizarre sort of risk, or you think you have the perfect solution. You're really good at this one thing, you go in and you just happen to roll really poorly and it doesn't work, and so then you have to come up with another thing. And they did such a fantastic job in this of like nodding to that and kind of baking that stuff into the way the narrative unfolds and progresses without being too much like, now we're going to make a Dungeons and Dragons reference. Now there was no
Mm-hmm.
meta joke about like rolling dice or like something like this, but they still managed to capture, like, you can see it really, especially with like that first scene or that first kind of battle where they get hauled out and they're about to be executed.
Oh, yeah.
She grabs the brick out of the
Mm-hmm.
ground and then like uses it. Like, that's exactly the kind of thing, the situation you get into in a role playing game where you're like, okay, I'm about to be executed. I need to get out of this somehow. And so you come up with this absurd thing like, I'm going to grab this brick out of here and then, use this ability to, stop the blade or something. And then you manage to just like roll flawless execution on that. And so your character just pulls off this absurd plan like
Mm-hmm.
flawlessly.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of fun when it happens in the game. And so it felt like they were applying that kind of mentality to how they were writing the story. And it actually makes for like kind of a fun progression to the narrative that sort of feels fresher than some of the story tropes that sometimes these stories can get ingrained in, where it's like, okay, we've spent the whole movie developing this one plot line, and so that kind of has to go well, because if it doesn't, then I don't know. I just felt like they did that really nicely and had a lot of fun with it. So I enjoyed that.
Hmm. Yeah, same. I also really liked the way they did the castle escape with the druid character Doric, where it's this fake one shot, but where she keeps transitioning into different animals, and you kind of follow her along during the whole ordeal. That and the I think every scene with the portal gun was very entertaining to me, which just made me wish like a lot more movies introduced portal guns in some way.
It actually briefly made me I was like, oh, of all the IP that we're reviving for films, can we get like a Portal the game movie? It
Yeah,
would probably be terrible,
probably, yeah. But still,
but it would be a lot of fun to watch.
I'd love to see a sort of hyper realistic primer-ish movie, but with portals.
Yes, with Portal, that would be great.
But yeah, that aside.
Yeah, I was not expecting this movie to have the best depiction of the portal gun mechanic from the Portal game that I've ever seen.
I did like the way they managed to add, like the thing with where they use the portals to rob, or not rob, but to
Get into
the wagon. I thought that was really cleverly done in a way that where it felt like I was actually sort of behind the writers, in the sense that, oh wait, I wouldn't have thought of that, or to do it like that. And that's something I really enjoy, when it really feels like you're being outmaneuvered as a viewer in a fun,
Right.
in a fun way, not in a kind of cynical way. But
That's where I really wonder if they kind of gamed out certain scenarios for this in the writing process, because there's a couple writers' names on this, but some of these scenes have such a quality of like of the role playing process, where I do wonder if they were like, okay, we have this scenario, we need to get in here. These are what the characters are, these are their abilities. How do we pull that off? And then they just approached it in the same way you would if you were playing the game yourself, because that's the kind of thing you come up with in those scenarios.
yeah.
Is like, oh, we have this portal thing. We got to get into this wagon. How do we do it? Here's this ridiculous plan.
Yeah, that, and I like the way they added that little complication at the end, where it seems like, are they going to do the trick? They get into the vault really easily, but then the portal tips over, and they're just staring at the ground, which is was also really fun. And also in the way that the druid character Doric managed to figure out a way around it by chipping out this little piece of stone, just enough for her to crawl through it as a worm. But yeah, maybe let's talk a little bit more about the characters specifically, like get an overview of the crew. We obviously have I think the main two characters would be Edkin and Holga, played by Chris Pine, who plays the Bard character, the guy who makes all the plans. And Holga, played by Michelle Rodriguez, who plays the barbarian type character, essentially.
And as the movie is setting up, they're kind of escaping from prison. There's a bit of like a prologue kind of explaining some of their backstory, how they got there. They're escaping from prison, and the long and short of it is they have to kind of go find and rescue his daughter, who is sort of being, I guess, kidnapped by the villain of the film,
which is Hugh Grant.
Yeah.
Forge is his character's name.
So they kind of reconnect, or they kind of form this little team, the party, in order to do that. There's a lot of steps in getting there, but eventually we get to where you have this, the main party, which includes Doric, who is the druid, and then we also have
Simon, played by Justice Smith, who is the wizard.
Yeah. So we have Simon the wizard, and they kind of form this like this scrappy group.
Band of Outsiders.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Chris Pine is really great in roles like these. He can pull off that great range between heartfelt moments and then the comedy without becoming too Ryan Reynoldsy.
Yes, I was just going to say that. I was like, he's almost like a better Ryan Reynolds in this scenario.
Yeah, there were some moments where it felt like he stepped into Ryan Reynolds
Yeah.
territory, which I cared less for. But overall, I think he's good in this. He carries it as much as he can.
Yeah. But he feels more sincere, I think, than the way Ryan Reynolds plays stuff, which I appreciate.
As a side note, this movie also had me thinking that Chris Pine would have made a great Nathan Drake in the Uncharted series. He does have that kind of Indiana Jonesy
Yes.
vibe of adventurer, which not a lot of actors nowadays can pull off.
That's true.
I'm not sure about you, but I was feeling less. I wasn't feeling as good about Michelle Rodriguez, her character. Like, I liked the character on the page or as it was written, but I felt like her performance was not bad, but, serviceable, but not. I think a better actress could have elevated that into something more than it was.
Yeah, I didn't really connect with that character emotionally at all. To be fair, I think the only, besides Chris Pine, I felt like her character and Sophia Lillis's as Doric were also a little underdeveloped. Like,
Mm,
a little bit of writing might have given her more to work, Michelle more to work with there, where we don't like they lean really heavily into Chris Pine's or into Edgin's backstory, and he's lost. So the setup that we kind of skimmed over is his wife gets killed by these evil red wizards, I think they're called,
hmm
but they had a child together. That's the daughter that's kidnapped. But Michelle Rodriguez, Holga, and Edgin have kind of raised this child together.
Yeah.
And they lean really heavily into kind of giving us some of the emotional backstory for Edgin, but they don't really do that for Olga. So if they had like given us a little bit more material there where they showed kind of her emotional connection
Yeah.
to Kira, it might have felt a little bit more. But I kind of agree. Like, for whatever reason, that performance felt a little more
Yeah.
flat to me.
I feel like has become she's a great character actress in the type of character that she usually plays, like the sort of
Right.
tough woman who can kick ass, she does it very well in the Fast and Furious series. I think she did well in Avatar, the first one where she plays this grunt pilot. But here, her character reminded me a little bit of Drax, played by Dave Bautista in the Guardians of the Galaxy, who also has this kind of deadpan quality to it, the way to the way his humor works or the way his personality is. But I feel like
Right.
whereas, someone like Dave Bautista was really good at elevating that into something more and adding layers to that beyond what was on the page, adding the drama and the heart to it. I felt like Michelle Rodriguez wasn't quite able to pull that off in a way that really made this role into something more than it was on the page. And I feel like I'm just trying to think of a different actress who would have been a better fit. I'm not sure if I can think of anyone from the top of my head. Maybe like a Mary Elizabeth Winstead type-ish actress. Although I'm not sure how much the racial element is intrinsic to the character. Anyways, I agree that it's also in part because she didn't have
Right.
that much material to work with.
Yeah.
Because of all the characters in the main group, I think the only ones that truly have a character arc are Atkin, obviously, who has to go from being this selfish or more self-centered person into one who is more truly selfless.
Yeah.
He wants to bring his wife back, but in the end he realizes he wants to bring his wife back, but he presents it as, I want to bring the mother back of my child. And then later
Yeah.
he realizes that actually the real mother was Olga all along. So there's a nice little character arc there. And the only other one I think is Simon the wizard, who goes from feeling very insecure and who basically lacks courage to believe in himself, and he grows into this more confident, self-assured wizard. But yeah, that I think are the two most distinctive, or maybe even the only real character arcs. Because, for Dorek, she's more of a background character. She doesn't get a lot of character moments in this,
Yeah.
aside from being the druid that can transform into these different animals, which leads to some fun sequences. But,
Yeah.
as for character work, there's not a lot that goes on there, I think. And the same goes for Holga. I was trying to remember if there was any progression.
There's an arc she goes from, so she has a tiny little man husband played by, spoilers,
Oh, yeah.
for maybe the best like reveal of the movie, a very miniature, oh, what's his name? My mind is
Bradley
fried.
Cooper.
Bradley Cooper, yes. So we
Yeah.
have a very tiny Bradley Cooper who is Olga's ex-husband. And then
Yeah.
at the end of the movie, she meets another tiny man.
Yeah. She lets go of her ex-husband. Is that the
Right, and moves on. She meets another guy in her type. I don't know. Yeah, but I'm joking because I think like that's the most we get in terms of an actual arc or progression for her.
Yeah, and that just stands so far apart from the thing that you mentioned, where she's also experiencing the loss of
Right.
Kira, the daughter character. That I almost forgot. Like, I liked that revelation at the end, where you get this little montage about her connecting with Kira and her being the real mom, essentially. But
Yeah.
it also came out of the blue, because it didn't feel like that was her struggle throughout
Yeah.
this movie. So that was something I was kind of feeling like little bit let down by.
It almost felt like they withheld that in order to have it kind of be a twist as a part of Edgin's like
Yeah.
character arc at the end.
Yeah, I wish there would have been more than sort of sadness brewing beneath
Yeah.
her character that we would then go, that we can
Yeah.
then go look back to and say, oh, that's why she was
Right.
really like this. But
Yeah.
that doesn't really help. I feel like that could have been probably the biggest missed opportunity for more emotional investment with minimal changes to the story as it is.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
But anyways, then we talked about Simon already. I think he was fine. They also briefly meet with Zeng, who I thought was kind of strange. He is the converted bad wizard
Yes.
who's now a good wizard.
He's strange for, I think, a very specific reason,
Oh yeah.
which is that he kind of represents a certain type of non-player character in a role-playing game. So for people who maybe haven't played Dungeons and Dragons or other
Oh.
role-playing games, you have like a group of people who are the players,
Mm.
and each of them plays a character, like in the party. So if you're playing this movie as a role-playing game, Edgin, Olga, Simon, and Doric would all be played by a player, and then you have your dungeon master who kind of runs the game, makes sure everybody is following the rules, but then also plays all the other characters. What that
Mm.
results in is sometimes, the character that the dungeon master comes up with is like really great and fun. Sometimes they're like slightly more annoying. Sometimes they have these weird quirks. But you often run into this situation where like the dungeon master kind of invents this character that maybe has like overly flowery language or overly two-dimensional like characteristics, because you have to come up with a lot of these characters on the fly. And so his character was kind of flat and two-dimensional, had some weird quirks, but
Mhm.
it's very much in a way that is kind of a meta joke about Dungeons and Dragons and
Yeah.
playing role-playing games like that. So I don't know if that like came through if you're not familiar with those things, but like even the joke about the way he's walking at the end is kind of like
Yeah, that was kind of odd, but I like that
yeah.
in a sort of funny way. The thing that kind of bugged me about it, that he was presented as this character who doesn't understand irony or sayings, and I felt like because I already had connected in my mind Holga to be the sort of Dave Bautista Drax character, I felt like, wait, are they going to introduce like another type
Another,
of
yeah.
who's also socially a little bit weird or out of touch with the way people communicate? And so that's when why I thought like, oh, that's a little bit too much of the same thing, or
Right,
it felt a
right.
little bit unnecessary or out of place, or I don't know. Also, just his place in the story feels kind of strange. He kind of comes in at some point and then he exits also at another, and
Right.
he's just briefly there for a little bit of it. But I don't know. It feels like he gets like too much attention for a character this small, or he's just kind of stuck in this place between not being small enough to be truly this secondary character, but also not being big enough to really be part of the main group. So
Right. Right.
he just kind of falls weirdly in between the character spaces, or something like that.
I can definitely see how he would come across that way. I think the sort of meta joke of what his character represents worked well enough for me that I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
really bothered by those things because I kind of found them funny on in their own context. Because that happens too in like a role playing game where, this a non-player character will just like show up, and then the DM will just eventually decide like, okay, we're done with them, and they'll just leave or die, or something will happen,
Mm-hmm.
or sometimes they stick around forever, uh, but or sometimes one time I was playing a role playing game and the DM created a really elaborate NPC, and my character, who was a Russian anarchist, got into a little bit of a sticky situation and killed the NPC, and the DM was really sad
Uh-oh.
because I because I killed him, and then I felt really bad, and then we just had to regret it for the rest of the game. But anyway, yeah,
That does make his character make more sense for me.
that's one of the things. Though I guess that's the double-edged sword of like the way they did this adaptation was they were fairly soft with a lot of those sort of references. Like they don't make it super obvious. Like, okay, now this is like an in joke in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure even for me, like I'm sure there's a bunch of jokes in here about specific rules or lore that I didn't get because I'm not familiar with like the actual Dungeons and Dragons rules. So I don't know. It's like you have to strike that balance between making it fun for the people who don't know, but
Yeah.
also having these in jokes. And I feel like they did that fairly well, but there's, obviously still places where it's going to be
Yeah.
a little wonky.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that takes care of the main characters. How about what did you think of the villains? We have uh Hugh Grant in the main-ish
As
villain, or
Forge.
maybe,
Yeah,
Sofina. I guess Sofina is the real big villain, but then
right.
Forge, played by Hugh Grant, he is the more personal, immediate villain that most of the story revolves around. Any
Yeah.
general thoughts on how they played into the story? And
I felt like splitting it in two like that, I kind of understand how it happened or why it was necessary, because you have this like false villain set up, and then behind him is we eventually find out she's a red wizard, and that connects back to like how Edgin's wife was killed. So it kind of matters for plot reasons, but I felt like like I didn't feel that compelled by her as a villain. Like she felt sort of one dimensional.
Mhm.
I don't know. Like I feel like if you had collapsed it down to one, you might have had a little bit more time to develop the motivation of a single villain and then make them a little bit more compelling.
Mhm.
Um, I thought Forge was fun. I kind of liked him as a villain, but then
Yeah.
he kind of gets undercut as being like, I don't know. I don't know. I didn't have any particularly strong feelings, besides the fact that I think they both felt a little underbaked, maybe because the
Mhm.
villainy was being split between them.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way largely. I think I did like the interplay between their different forms of villainry, especially in the way that it led to interesting changes in the plot. Especially early on, there was this moment where there's a few things that always get me a little bit disengaged in a movie, and one of them is whenever characters have a goal, but to get to the goal, they first have to go on some kind of a miniature fetch quest to get
Right.
something to get to the other thing, which they had in this movie where they had to get the helmet to break the spell that's on the vault, that which is the thing that they really wanted to get to. I think the way villains and also their bad or like their evil master plans developed was interesting enough that didn't bother me so much, that it kept the plot going in enough different directions and quick enough, like at a quick enough pace for me,
Yeah.
some to keep that level of engagement at least alive. It wasn't like fully into it. Like it's not Top Gun Maverick where I was like fully invested in the
Right, right.
mission and completely engaged, but it was like good enough, where I cared up until the very end. Whereas usually with a Marvel movie, I'm kind of checked out by the third act, and where like okay, now the bad guy's coming, now they're gonna do the fist fight, or now the sky beam is coming, or something like that. And there was some disappointment where this movie also had a almost literal sky beam at the end, where
Yes, yes.
because of the dual villains, you also get this fourth act syndrome. I think
Yeah.
it's called, where you kind of have the basic story resolved, but then in this case, where they escape out of the arena, at some point the crew gets captured, and then you have this little Austin Powers moment where the villain doesn't kill them immediately, but throws them in the arena to watch them die instead. They escape from the arena. They realize that Forge's big bad plan wasn't actually to be the master of that territory, or
Yeah.
I forget what his title was, but the Lord of the Neverwinter. But he was just gonna rob all the rich citizens and then take off in a boat while Sophina does her big
Yeah.
bad plan. Um, but then the main guys, they escape from the arena, they foil the plan of Forge, and then it seems like the main issue or the main conflict is resolved, because that's when Forge is defeated. Chris Pine has his daughter back, and they can sail off into the distance with all the riches. But then, of course, because there's this secondary villain, they have to go back for more story to do. And that's for me something that's very difficult to pull off, because there's a natural endpoint where you kind of feel, okay, I'm now done with this story, and now I
Right.
have to kind of psych myself up to get invested in another 15 minutes of this, or
Yeah.
in another story element. But I
Yeah.
liked, at first I was like, oh God, it's going to be another one of those Skybeam, big bad
Right.
villain that you don't really care
Yeah.
about with magic powers. And but what I liked is that it went relatively quickly. They do another portal
Yes.
trick. It wasn't like this prolonged, exhausting sequence. They kind of rushed through it in a way that I thought was actually a good choice,
Yeah.
and that really kept the pacing up and kept me interested.
It might have been better to not do it at all, but if you're
Yeah.
gonna do it, the better. If you're gonna do it, the lesser sin is to just get it over with
Mm.
quickly.
I guess it made sense because without Sophina there, Forge's twist also wouldn't have made sense. Then
Right.
it would have made more sense for him to just stay in his position. So I guess I can kind
Yeah.
of see why the twist was necessary, and I can see why the twist was interesting, because it has you. There's this moment where then Doric gets into the vault, and then they find a way into the vault separately, where Doric finds their way in through the original plan, which was
Right.
the portal, and then actually
Well,
Simon is
no,
the
no, that was
original plan.
plan.
That
That
was
was plan C,
yeah.
or no, or no, plans A and B had stink on those. So they had to come up.
So yeah, plan C and D both worked, and that to me, that they didn't end up in the same place, that to me was an interesting twist that I genuinely didn't see
Yes.
coming, and that had me
Yeah.
curious again to see, okay, now this is an interesting complication. Where do we go from here? But of
Yeah.
course, all that ties into the necessity of having Sophina be who she was, and having her
Right.
have the plan that she has.
Yeah.
So fine, I'll accept that it was a necessity to tell the rest of the story, and in that sense, I like the way it kind of resolved itself pretty quickly, and then the fight was also, I think, I'm trying to remember how exactly that went down. I think they just knocked her out of the sky with something, if I remember correctly, and then they fought on the
And
ground
then
for
they
a little
fight.
bit.
Yeah. And it's kind of the culmination of like, oh, they've all gained, they're all better at what they do now to some
Hmm.
extent. So they kind of, especially Simon, has more advanced wizard powers at this point. So
Hmm.
they're more capable in the fight. It definitely wasn't that bad. I've seen much worse. Now the villains are going to smash each other at the end and just kind of like collide.
And I can also see why this was a necessary final set piece to really complete Chris Pine's character arc, because before that he would just get what he wants, and now with
Yes.
this final set piece he gets what he needs, which is
Right.
generally the thing that a character arc is made of. They go on a journey to get what they think they want, but in the end they get what they actually needed, which is usually something else. And then what they need is the thing that deconstructs their initial want and gives them a deeper insight into themselves and therefore, what they needed as a character. That's also
Yeah.
something that they could have done maybe a little bit better, where Holga kind of just seems to be hurt out of the blue, like it seems to be all over, and then, oh
Yeah.
wait, she now has the dagger or something. I think it was a dagger inside of her that is gonna lead to something bad if they don't use that
Yeah.
resurrection stone that he actually saved for his wife.
It did kind of feel to me like this fourth act kind of segment may have actually initially been longer, but then they kind of
Mm-hmm.
cut it down for time, which was probably the right choice,
Yep.
once they were done, given the pacing. And I think like dragging it on wouldn't have been great. But yeah, it does kind of it feels more like there was more material there that they had to like shrink down instead of like it was just written this way from the beginning. That's kind of the vibe I got.
Yeah.
Because it all works, but there's just like a few things where yeah, like it would have been nice maybe to see some of the moments happen that kind of get glossed over.
Yeah. I think it was a good choice at the end also because I think Forge was very much the more charismatic villain, and so when
Yes,
he's out of the picture, that's just the bland evil wizard and the even
right.
blander sort of Voldemort that she was gonna
Yeah, yeah.
summon. I guess
Right.
they realized, rightfully so, that that's not the emotional connection there, or the emotional engagement there isn't as strong as there
Yeah,
was in the conflict with Forge. So we're gonna kind of rush through this, highlights only, and then get out
yeah.
while the getting is good.
And that does allow them to spend time kind of in the emotional or the more emotional scene of Olga dying and then them reviving her and
Mm-hmm.
like Edgin kind of having to make this decision or sacrifice and completing his arc a little bit. They spend plenty of time there actually letting that kind of take up space, which is good as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because even though, as we talked about earlier, the whole setup for that last switcheroo, I guess, didn't really work for me. I think the moment itself, I did find that effective and I did feel moved by it. It's also one of those things where you kind of where they set up a story like, oh, I'm Chris Pine, my wife is dead, I'm gonna resurrect her, but then you already know the wife character is played by this lesser known actress,
Right, right.
and she doesn't come back into the story at
Yeah,
all, then you probably can guess like, oh, she is not gonna be the one who ends up being resurrected at the end. It's usually gonna be usually when you have a setup like that, obviously there's not literal setups or literal examples of situations that are exactly the same, but usually the story does ending up being about one of the characters that you as the
right.
audience travel along with, instead of the character that's just set up at the beginning as some memory for the character, but not someone who you as the audience, or that you as the
Yeah,
audience actually get to know. But still, even though I was already expecting the stone, or the resurrection stone or tablet, whatever it was, wasn't gonna work out in the way that they originally planned it. For some reason, this one still got me off guard a little bit, where I didn't expect it, that it was gonna be Holga or one of the crew who ended up being the ones who would be revived.
Yeah, they managed to pull that off fairly well. It's also the kind of moral dilemma that a brilliant DM would come up with
Mm.
to hand to a character or a player. And
Yeah.
that's the beauty of playing a game like this. If you land in this situation and being faced with this kind of decision and then getting to not just watch a character have an arc, but get to participate in that arc yourself and get to make the decision of being like, oh, I know my whole character has been motivated this whole time by trying to go back and revive my dead wife, but I'm faced with this choice here, and I'm gonna make the choice to do this thing, and kind of getting to participate in that arc is a lot of fun.
Yeah. They also add in they also add an interesting minor complication, I guess, earlier in the story where you have Chris Pine talking with Zeng, and he talks about his wife, or no, he talks about there being multiple lives, or this that our life is just one in a realm of many forms of living, or forms of being. I'm not sure exactly how he phrased it, but he seems to suggest that there are either afterlives or other forms of reincarnation, and that if he would to resurrect his wife after all this time, he would be kind of robbing her out of a new
Life,
form of
yes,
existence that she has
yeah,
now been in for a while. And I thought, I'm not sure about how the lore or what the lore says about other spiritual realms in this world. I'm guessing there are some, but it's not really brought up again. But that's also one line that had me thinking, oh yeah, it's probably not going to play out in the way that it's set up in the beginning. But I did like that they at least added some additional conflict along the way, that it wasn't just going to be reviving the dead is something that you can just do with the stone, but there's also going to be some sort of cost to it, to the person who
right,
is going to be revived, that you do not know if you're in this realm still, so to say. And
yeah,
there's also a little bit of, I'm not sure if this how closely this connects to that, but there's this fun little graveyard scene where they ask questions to the dead.
right, right,
Yeah, I'm not saying that that relates to Chris Pine's dead wife in any meaningful way, but it does show, there's, I'm not sure if I have a point to make here, but it does show there's some kind of discomfort with bringing back the dead and
right, right,
leaving them in, or bringing them back into a realm from a place, from whatever place they came from, and
yeah,
it's not something that's gonna be, just gonna tap the stone into the right direction and then the wife's gonna be back and everything's gonna be fine. There's gonna
yeah,
be weirdness there, or
yeah.
potentially some morally gray um, implications.
Yeah. There's a lot of great elements of playing and crafting like a role playing game, or like kind of guidelines for being a good dungeon master, that are actually kind of I guess not coincidentally, good, like good approaches to just storytelling in general. And one of those things, like if you're being a DM, that they, one of the pieces of advice is to give everything kind of like a cost or a downside, or
Mm-hmm.
try to give everything, like complicate everything a little bit, so that it's not just this is an easy choice and there's no, like, we know it's going to work, it's fine, it's a pure good. The more you can make everything a little bit of a choice, or have some kind of element of sacrifice, or not know exactly what the side effects might be, the more fun it's going to be for the players to play. But that's just also like a good way to approach storytelling in general. Like if you're a writer, the more you can make something, the more you can make the characters have to wrestle with, like, is this thing that I want to do a pure good, or is there some kind of side effect or cost, or sacrifice that I have to make in order for that to come about.
Mm-hmm.
I think um, the more interesting the story is usually, to watch or read, or whatever.
as I said in the beginning, it's a nice movie that will pleasantly surprise you if you're back in 1995 browsing TV channels looking for something to watch and then kind of stumbling onto this without knowing anything about it. I think that's the scenario in which this movie will surprise you the most in a pleasant way. But even updated to today's standards, yeah, I think it's just if you're just looking for a relatively fun, lighthearted, non-frustrating adventure movie
Yes, yeah.
that will not have you sighing or rolling your eyes too much, especially if you're kind of growing fatigued of the marvelization of movies, then I think this one is pretty decent. Go see it with some friends, and yeah, I guess, and then go back to Lord of the Rings.
Right. I think I would definitely recommend it to anybody who's either a fan of D&D or just,
Hmm.
a fan of playing RPGs in general. I think if I didn't have that context,
Yep.
I don't know how much I would have enjoyed this. If you're like me where this style of movie, maybe is fatiguing you a little bit, but you're into this particular IP, I think that'll probably like buoy it a
Hmm.
little bit. Um, this is one where I actually, coming out of it, I was like, I kind of actually think I might go see another one of these if they make it. I just hope if I could say one thing to the writers and the executives and the producers of these kinds of films, it's that you think these big stakes, huge, like escalating everything into big stakes is making it more interesting and less boring and more exciting for your audience. It's not. If you keep the stakes small,
Hmm.
it will actually counterintuitively be more interesting and
Yep.
better and more engaging dramatically and emotionally and all of those things. I firmly believe that. There's so many times where these movies they start off on such a good foot, and I think a lot of times that's because things start out fairly small and contained at the beginning. Applies especially to fights. Like
Yep.
a lot of times in these movies, the fights at the towards the like first half of the movie are much more interesting because they're smaller, they're more contained, the stakes are smaller, and the audience can understand what's going on. It's visually interesting, it's a little bit quirky and unexpected sometimes. And and in those battles often we don't know that like it has to end a certain way. So that helps a little bit too. But it doesn't have to escalate into this like world ending save the world moment for
Hmm.
it to be good. So stop doing that. I don't know. I get it. I know why it happens. It's a trope at this point. It's just the way it goes. But like that was exciting the first like 3 times we saw it, and now it's been unexciting for like 6 movies. So
Hmm.
calm down, lower the stakes, and paradoxically, it'll get better. So please, I beg of you. That's
Yep.
ironically because I think people are starting to like, even the MCU films have started to perform a little bit worse. Like this style of film kind of, I feel like had its heyday and is declining a little bit. Um, and so people are starting to get a little worried almost.
Hmm.
But I think paradoxically, the thing that would make a lot of these movies better is just like scaling them back just a little, just enough, and then giving more care and attention to the smaller scale to give everything kind of impact and conflict and emotional weight and those kinds of things. Uh, anyway, rant over. None of those people are listening to this podcast, so
Just
but
in case.
just in case.
Lastly, do you have any other movies that you would recommend as being the most if you enjoy Dungeons and Dragons, then what would you watch next?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like going back to some of the old classics that might exist in this
Hmm.
same vibe. You kind of talked about that a little bit at the beginning. But it did make me a little bit nostalgic for just the kind of like fun fantasy world stuff like The Princess Bride is a great example too of
Oh
just
yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
goofy. It's not taking itself very seriously. It's very lighthearted, but it's still playing with familiar, like, sort of fantasy tropes and mechanics that we know and expect. So maybe that would be my recommendation. If you liked this and you haven't for some reason you haven't seen The Princess Bride, that seems like a movie you should definitely watch.
Yeah, I was thinking of maybe not as close, I think, as The Princess Bride, but maybe A Knight's Tale.
Yeah.
At least in my memory, was a really fun movie that also plays around a little bit with the tropes of the medieval movie or story.
Yes.
Even though I don't think that was a fantasy story, just a medieval setting. Right. Maybe something like The Brothers Grimm, both starring Heath Ledger for some reason. I haven't seen that one in years though, so I'm not sure exactly how good of a movie that was, but it just feels like early 2000s era fantasy-ish historical settings are what this movie for me related most closely to.
Good rec. All right, so that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, you can already listen to next week's episode on Nebula, as well as catching all of our bonus episodes on there. Most recently, we've talked about Fight Club, we talked about Babylon, we've talked about Avatar, The Way of Water, a bunch of other great films, 1917, Drive. There's a new one every month. You can catch those by signing up for Nebula and listening to the Nebula feed, which you can listen to on your normal podcast player, by the way. If you put the private feed that you get from Nebula into your podcast player, you can listen just how you normally do. Go to nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or use the link in the description below. You can also check out our Patreon Discord there. The link is in the description for how you get access to that. We have discussions about what we're watching. You can find out what we are doing as an episode weeks ahead so that you can watch the films if you want with us. All that great stuff. So we appreciate your support and you listening, and check those things out if you want more. Otherwise, we'll catch you next week.